Hey everyone, welcome back. This is Nabil Qureshi and David Wood with the unofficial Seeking Allah Finding Jesus video series. By the way, there is an official Seeking Allah Finding Jesus DVD study and video series, and that is a resource that I would highly suggest you get. It's designed to be studied in small groups. It's, the length of each session is perfect for small group study. What David and I are sharing here is just little tidbits of information. You'll get much more depth in that, and of course in the actual book, Seeking Allah Finding Jesus. So anyhow, in this session, what we want to talk about is understanding different kinds of Muslims. Now, one of the most common objections I get anytime I present a case about Islam, or whenever I try to give my reasons for having left Islam, is people are going to come at me and say, you were from this sect, that sect doesn't represent Islam, and then they'll just, as if that responds to all the information that I'm presenting about Muhammad and the Quran and the history of Islam, they'll just point to the sect and say that doesn't count. Within Islam, you have a tremendous amount of division, And you may have heard of the Sunni-Shia division. There are countries where officially Shia are not considered Muslim. There are countries where officially Sunnis are in the minority, and they're often treated as non-Muslim. You have other varieties of subsects of Islam that, the smaller the sect is, the more regularly it's beat up on by the larger sects. And so you have this diversity within Islam that you need to understand. If you try to approach a Shia, for example, and you present a hadith that was relayed by Aisha, not going to work. They have their, Aisha is considered al-Mu'mineen amongst the Sunnis. So 80% of Muslims believe Aisha is the mother of all believers, and they hold her with a tremendous amount of respect. But if you come to a Shia and you present a hadith from Aisha, they're going to see her as an immediate traitor, and so that information is not going to work.
By the way, I when I first learned about that, when I was learning about Islam, I went to a Muslim chat room online, and I was like, "Hey, I just heard this Muslim saying that he doesn't like Aisha. Is it true that there are Muslims who don't like Aisha?" Because I was going through Bukhari, and Aisha's everywhere in Bukhari. And so I said it there. I said, is it true that there are Muslims who don't like Aisha? And this erupted, right? I mean, everyone started going off. People calling down curses on her, and people calling down curses on the people who are calling down curses on her. And then someone shut down the discussion and sent me a message and said, "Look what you did. We're on to you. Don't try this again. We're blocking you." And I was like, I was actually asking. I was trying to learn here. So anyway. They take certain issues like that very seriously.
Yeah, and so you have differences among Muslims. If you just see Muslims as a monolithic set of people, chances are you probably haven't spent any time with real Muslims, because you realize they're all extremely different. And just the sect of Islam that you're coming from is just one of the tremendous differences. And you can have within a sect differences. So for example, myself, I was much more by the books than, say, my sister. My sister would quote Oprah for you, thinking that it was something that Islam taught. Like she would quote something about multiculturalism and pluralism, and really it was something that I would have heard from Oprah, and she would have thought that it was from the Quran. Whereas I would quote a hadith, and she would say, "I've never heard that before." And so we're in the same family, and so you have to. And then one other big difference between Muslims would I'd say be the region that they come from. And so if you have Muslims from Saudi, they're going to have a certain background. If you have Muslims from Indonesia, they're going to have a certain cultural similarity to themselves. If you have Muslims from Pakistan, it's going to be very different from Muslims from Bosnia, for example, or Muslims from Morocco. And I would even dare say Muslims in the West now. You have, second generation Muslims who were born and raised in the West. They have their own culture, which is very different from Muslims all over the rest of the world. And so you need to understand the different types of Muslims.
Mm-hmm. And so going along with that, that's closer to what you said about you and your sister, is that you can have these individual personality differences. And you can even have personality differences within the same Muslim over time, right? Muslims can change over time. That's what we often hear about, a Muslim being very radical and then becoming peaceful later on, or starting off very peaceful and then shocking everyone when he runs off to join ISIS or something like
It's
that.
heartbreaking to see these parents crying on TV saying, my child was raised peaceful. What happened to them?
So people can change. People can be different from one another, and then people can be different from themselves over time. And so, but in the last video, we were talking about if you're trying to decide what approach you want to take with Islam, you need to know about yourself and need to know what your goals are and how you intend on approaching these things. But what we want to talk about now is knowing the Muslims, right? Being aware of the Muslim you're talking to, and this is really on a case-by-case basis. And the reason it's important because you might talk to someone and his name might be Nabil or something like this, and you think, oh, here's a Muslim, but he might be completely secular. He might not care about Islam at all. And he could just really, really not care, or he could genuinely believe, but just not make it a tremendous priority in his life. So similar, I mean, we're aware of Christians like this. You have all kinds of a spectrum of Christians. So you can have people that don't really care, that don't take it very seriously, and you start talking about Muhammad and they don't really care, and they just want to get away from this conversation because they think you're some sort of fanatic, and they're not fanatics and stuff, so why would they want to talk to you? And then even within an individual person's life, because I was learning this as we went along with Nabil. We've mentioned before that our first conversation where we're talking about this, Nabil told me that Islam is proven true by science and reason and logic and history and mathematics. Everything proves that Islam is true. And he was this is the way it is. Let's examine it if you don't believe me. So notice that approach. I love meeting people like that. I love meeting people who say, here's how I know that this is true. And we can examine it to see if it's true. That's my favorite people to run into because
we're very logically oriented. We want to be able to. This is your claim. Let's test it. Like that's how we were trained to function in the university setting.
And so we can open up the books and we can get to the bottom of this. That was Nabil when we first met, and as we started doing that, as we started going through this material, I noticed over time that he lost sort of some of the confidence in some of those earlier claims that he was making. And it was a couple years later, and we were on another school trip. And I remember he just didn't seem to have that same, here's everything that proves that Islam is true. And so I asked him again, I said, why do you believe that Islam is true? And he said 2 reasons mainly. 1, it makes sense to me. And 2, the people that I've felt the presence of God on most strongly were Muslims, my grandparents. But it's very easy to miss the shift. If you're not paying attention, you can miss that shift that just took place. When he's saying that Islam is proven true by science and math and everything else, that's testable. We can open up books and see if his claims are true or not. If you tell me that you felt the presence of God on your grandma, there's no way to test that. There's no way for me to prove that's wrong. There's no way for me to examine what you felt. And so we just went from the realm of testable to untestable. And that's within Nabil. And I'm pointing this out because there are Muslims in both those categories, right? There are Muslims who believe that Islam is proven true by all these things and we can get to the bottom of it. And there are Muslims who believe in Islam because they believe they felt the presence of God on their grandma or because Islam made sense to them. It's not actually anything hard and fast that you can examine. It's more feelings based or it just seems that way to them.
And notice the shift was actually because we did test those claims. And over the course of those years, when I'm saying, hey, the Quran has never been changed, and I look at how the Quran was changed from day one till at least the 1920s, all of a sudden I don't have confidence in that anymore. Muhammad is the most perfect man who ever lived. You can look at his life and you'll conclude that he's a prophet. You start looking at his life and finding all these horrible things about him, and you're like, wait a minute, I can't stand on that anymore. And so when you're dialoguing with someone and they're progressing from one stage to another, keep an eye on what stage they're at, but also the reasons why they're getting there, because that's telling you something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you certainly have to pay attention to those because you're going to have to adapt your approach. So I was actually very concerned when Nabil's entire approach changed because, wait a minute, now how do I prove this wrong? But I realized that okay, I can't prove that he doesn't feel the presence of God on his grandma, or that Islam doesn't make sense to him, or something like that. But I can continue showing him evidence for Christianity and showing problems with Islam, and show that there's evidence that outweighs the evidence on which his confidence in Islam is now based. So we kept going, and then another shift occurred even later, and that's when we were talking, and you told me that human beings are biased, and we're limited in our knowledge, and we only know a fraction of what can be known, and we've been raised to believe certain things, and so on. And so there's so much bias at work here that we just can't know. We just can't know that we've gotten to the truth.
It was specifically on the issue of Jesus' deity, and my objection was at this point, look, I've been raised my whole life to believe that Jesus is not God. That's been drilled into my head from day one. How could God expect me to believe in that doctrine, to have hold of a certain bit of knowledge, when I've been trained my whole life to not believe that? How could God expect me to believe that finite bit of knowledge, or else send me to hell forever? It's just not fair.
But God is fair, and therefore He wouldn't hold you accountable for that sort of thing. That was your reason. God's not going to condemn me for something.
That was my reasoning at the time. It's like, yeah, God can't possibly send me to hell for not believing Jesus is God, given my background and what I've been taught.
And so now, if I'm looking at this, now I'm dealing with a person who doesn't even trust his own cognitive faculties to get him to the truth about something like this. If you're trying to give evidence to someone, how do you give evidence to someone who doesn't even trust his own mental abilities to get him to the truth of things? And so
it was kind of like a last-ditch effort. I was like, there's really no way out of this objection. And I also want to give kind of a glimpse of the time lapse here. I met David within the first few weeks of my freshman year of university. This conversation we had as we were graduating. I remember exactly where we were. We were parked in the Constant Convocation Center garage, and we had just received awards. We both received Kaufman honors when we were graduating from our university, and we were having this discussion because I'm about to go to medical school. David's about to do who knows what, and for David, this is where are we now? We've been talking about this for years, and I was trying my absolute best to not have to face the facts.
Whereas for me, it's I don't know how many opportunities I'm going to have left, because we're going to be heading in different directions right now. We're not going to be seeing each other all the time anymore. And if his final takeaway is, God's not going to hold me accountable because I can't really be that responsible.
Why were you always in my
terrifying.
car? Why were you always in my car?
You had a nicer car than I did.
That's true.
Yeah. So that was just terrifying. But it's another shift I noticed. But keep in mind, you have these different kinds of stages, even in one individual's life. Think about how many more different types of Muslims out there. But I mean, as far as just broad categories, you have people who care and people who don't care. You have people among those who do care. You have people whose confidence is evidence-based. You have people whose confidence is more feelings-based. You have to be paying attention to the sort of people you're talking to. And there are other issues. Even if you're dealing with someone whose approach is evidence-based, there can be other factors involved, which is another, which I learned from you, and I thought was just you, but then I met more Muslims over time. And this is when we watched William Lane Craig versus Jamal Badawi.
Oh yeah, that debate.
I watched this beforehand, and I saw that Craig absolutely crushed Badawi. And so I really wanted to watch this with Nabil.
We would get together and watch debates between Muslims and Christians regularly.
And then we would compare them. We'd say who won, and then we'd explain why. We'd go through their points and so on. Sometimes we would watch them. We would play an opening statement, then discuss it, then play the other person's opening statement, discuss it, and then keep going through like that.
This debate was between William Lane Craig and Jamal Badawi.
And Craig, you can watch this, Craig crushed Badawi. He answered, as far as arguments are concerned, Badawi couldn't answer any of Craig's arguments very well. Craig answered Badawi's arguments very well. And in the end, there was even a part where Badawi got angry and started yelling. Now, this is where the difference comes in. because after the debate was finished, I would have scored that like 95-5, being generous. That's how one-sided I thought the debate was. We finished the debate, and I say, "So, what'd you think about that?" He said, "Well, Badawi clearly won, but I can understand if someone's a Christian, then you side with your guy." So he was saying something along those lines. But I'm thinking, what were you watching? What did you just see on that screen? Because I understand that there are Christians who are just going to side with the Christian debater, no matter, even if the Christian debater got crushed. And there are Muslims who are going to side with the Muslim debater, even if the Muslim debater got crushed. But this is not one of those people. He's a very intelligent guy who's able to follow the arguments, and yet he's concluding that Badawi won. It was another couple years after that to really unpack that, until he finally was breaking everything down to me. Just for instance, when Badawi got angry and started yelling at a point in that debate, most of us who grew up in the West would look at that and say, "You were yelling because you're angry, you're desperate, you're frustrated, you're losing, you're losing, and so you're so angry that you start yelling." Nabil's watching this. He explained later that when he sees Badawi start yelling, he's actually thinking he's yelling because he's so passionate for the truth, because deep down he knows, he's so confident that he has the truth here. And this other guy is blaspheming God by talking about God in this way. And so he's so passionate that he yells something, and the Christian debater is completely calm, because deep down, he doesn't even believe this stuff. He doesn't even take it seriously enough to get as passionate as the Muslim debater. So we're interpreting just tone and body language in completely different ways. And that's something I had to pay attention to. But again, at that point, I thought that was just Nabil. Later, after you became a Christian, we started debating. When I would get up and the topic would be whether Muhammad's a prophet, and I would start giving my reasons why I didn't believe Muhammad is a prophet, there would be like nice little old Muslim ladies sitting in the front row, and I really don't want to be mean and hurt their feelings and give them all this mean information about their prophet that they've never heard before. But I had to, because it's a debate, so I have to give my reasons. But I would give them the information very gently and say, "Okay, well, this is my reason why I don't believe in Muhammad," and so on. And I'm just trying to be sort of timid while presenting the information. And they would walk out of there going, the Christian debater is so weak, he clearly lost. I was like, what? What are you talking about? This is airtight information about Muhammad. Anyway, later I would get ticked off, and I would present the exact same argument, but I would present it differently. I would go, "How can you believe in this stuff? This is clear nonsense. I mean, oh my goodness," and giving it that way. And there were people, they would walk out of there, "He's destroying our prophet." And I was, wait, what were you looking at? You weren't paying attention to the arguments. You were paying more attention to how I was presenting it. And so it occurred to me that you can have different cultures, especially people from different parts of the world, who are paying attention to more than just the arguments. They're paying attention to your tone, to your confidence, to your passion, to things like that. Whereas me, I mean, it doesn't matter. You could be yelling at me, you could slap me in my face. At the end of the day, I'm looking at your argument, and do you have a good argument or a bad argument? I might be mad because of something you've done, but at the end of the day, if you've got the best argument, you've got the best argument. But it's looking at that and realizing, wait a minute, there are Muslims who are paying attention to different things from the way other people would pay attention to them. Have to be aware of those kinds of things, because you have very nice Muslims and you would want to present information very nicely to them. You have other Muslims who actually respect you more if you're more direct, confrontational. This is the truth. You're passionate. You're fearless. You're ready to die if necessary, if threatened, and so on. There are Muslims who are looking at that and saying, "Wow, this person is so confident that I need to listen to what this person is saying."
My background was a bit of a bridge because I was raised in the West. I'd gone through Western education systems, Western university, etc. But my parents, particularly my mother, was very Eastern in her worldview, in her perspective. And I inherited a lot of that. And so the way I saw the world was heavily colored by an Eastern perspective, though I was raised in the West. And so I would be analyzing a lot of the argumentation through an Eastern lens, but with, some of the Western critical thinking skills. And so that was me, and David had to get acclimatized to that. I didn't understand him. I was like, how in the world could you have seen that debate with William Lane Craig and thought that Craig won when Craig was talking about something that was completely irrelevant. If Craig was focused on the issue of love, and as a Muslim, to me, the focusing, the debate on the issue of love was more or less irrelevant. It's very relevant if you're a Christian, of course, but as a Muslim, why is he spending all his time talking about this? It's like he's being irrelevant, he's being passive, he doesn't care, and he's clearly not engaging with Badawi's, passion. I was like, how could you have seen this? So I had to understand his perspective, the cold, calculating Westerner kind of perspective. That's the stereotype, and that was kind of more or less true. And again, going back to the second video in this series, relationships are what bridge the gap here. If I didn't know David and I saw him react that way, I'd think, oh, this guy's just a crazy Christian, and I'd walk out. But I know him, and so how do I reconcile the fact that my good buddy saw this debate and saw, a generous scoring is 95-5 in favor of the Christian? How do you do that? So that was my perspective. But you're going to have Muslims who are raised in the West, who have a very Western perspective, who see things as Westerners do, and you'd approach them differently. I would say my sister fell closer to that category. Most of my Muslim friends, I would say, fell closer to that category. By the way, I was one out of very, very few Muslims I knew in my community who would spend time praying 5 times a day, who would spend time memorizing chapters of the Quran in Arabic, who would spend time going through the hadith to learn what they say, to read the seerah in my free time. I knew probably on my 2 hands the number of other people out of the thousands of Muslims I knew. Probably on my 2 hands I could count other Muslims my age who were doing the same thing, who had the same level of devotion. And so the vast majority of people you'd meet were just simply not as devout, and that would be a result of probably their Western upbringing. Their parents probably came to the West, tried to assimilate to the West. My mom didn't try to assimilate much at all. My mom, when we were growing up, we spoke the language that my parents spoke growing up, Urdu. We spoke that in the house, even though we were growing up in America and for a few years in Scotland. My mom didn't try to assimilate at all, and so my perspective of the world was different from those Muslims in our Islamic community who were raised in the West by parents who did try to assimilate to the West. And so these differences are going to play out in your relationship, and you just need to be able to understand who it is that you're loving, who is the Muslim that you're sharing with, and meeting them where they are.
Yeah. So continuing along the lines of what's the best approach here or there. That depends on what sort of person you are, but it also depends on the Muslim you're talking to. Just if we're talking about the different personality types and so on, like there are lots of Christians who think I'm way too aggressive because I'm talking about the most sensitive topics. I know that there are Muslims who are watching this going, oh my goodness, he's giving us all this horrible information about our prophet. I know that, but I'm interested in talking to Muslims who are really serious about these sorts of things and who can take. If you're a Muslim and you don't want to have that kind of conversation, you start talking to me. Okay, well, I'll listen to someone else. And one of the reasons I've gone in this direction is because there are lots of Christians who will preach the gospel. There are lots of loving Christians out there who share the gospel with Muslims, but there are different kinds of Muslims who don't care how nice you are. They don't care how loving you are. They don't care how sweet you are to them. If they are going to reject Islam, you really have to put it right in their face on why they're following a false prophet. But even along these lines, there are different ways of presenting even sensitive information. If we're talking about to pick a very sensitive issue in dealing with, so lots of Muslims, can get upset if you bring up Muhammad and Aisha, that Muhammad had a child bride who was 9 years old when they consummated the marriage. So if you're talking to a more aggressive Muslim, you might say, your prophet had sex with a 9-year-old girl. How do you explain that? You don't want to say that to a nice Muslim that you're trying to have a conversation with. But even in that case, you can present the same kind of information, but knowing the person you're dealing with, you would present the same information differently. And again, this isn't something you would present in your first encounter or something like this, but it might be something that you might want to share if they believe that Muhammad is the greatest example for mankind and so on. You might want to share information over time that they haven't had to, that information has not been presented to them. And the way you would do that is, instead of saying, hey, your prophet did this or that, you say, hey, I was reading this article online about Muhammad and so on, and I was wondering what's your perspective on that. I mean, could you read this, look at the sources, maybe talk it over with your imam to get his perspective, and could you get back to me next week and tell me what you think about this? Because I would like to know what you think about this, and just not so that I'm reading what some critic of Islam wrote, but actually getting your feedback. And now you're not attacking, you're not blasting someone, you're not making fun of someone. You're asking a person for information about his or her religion, and lots of people would love to share information with you. And so there are different approaches, and that's the point. You need to know the basics of Christianity. You need to know basic Christian apologetics. There are certain things you need to know about Islam, but there's always keep in mind what sort of person you are, what sort of people you're trying to reach, because that's going to affect how you present things.
Anything else to cover on this topic?
No, that's good.
Yeah, so one quick tidbit of advice. If you're engaging with a Muslim and you're like, how do I even start? Like, how do I know? This is someone I'm just meeting. How am I supposed to even gauge where this person is? Is he devout? Is he not devout? How does he see the world, etc.? I would say the most practical and immediate way you can figure it out is listen to their accent. If they are, don't take a look at their body, their skin, their name, all that stuff. They could be born and raised in the West. They could be, watching Game of Thrones, with their free time. That's the kind of, cultural background they have. Exactly what the rest of us have, with a very Muslim name, very Muslim looking, body type. What would you call it? Race, ethnicity. That's not going to get you anywhere. But whereas the accent often will. It'll tell you if someone has been born and raised in the West or not. So do they have a British accent? Well, then they're a Westerner. Do they have an American accent? Treat them as a Westerner. Do they have a Moroccan accent? Well, now approach them understanding that they're probably seeing the world through an Eastern perspective. Probably. You still can't be 100% certain on any of this, but it's a good place to start if you need to make a snap judgment.
Yeah, and after that, the next step would be just asking some questions, right? I mean, most Muslims would love to answer the question, regardless of what kind of Muslim they are. Would love to answer the question. If you say, "Hey, I've heard some things about Muslims on the media and stuff like this, and on the internet. I just wonder, could you tell me what you as a Muslim believe?" And if you start hearing, Islam is proven true by facts and reason and evidence and logic, Muhammad is clearly a prophet in Islam, Christianity is false, and Jesus, you know what kind of Muslim you're dealing with, right? And you have an idea of what kind of approach to take. If you're saying, if the person says, yes, I'm a Muslim, but to each his own, we all have it's all different paths to God, that just also told you something about what kind of Muslim you're dealing with. So just in the course of asking a few questions, you can know what sort of Muslim you're dealing with, and that will inform your approach.
Great. So thanks for watching. We're going to now move on to some of the more informative aspects of the investigation between Islam and Christianity. There's a lot of evidence to consider here. Once again, you'll go a lot more deep if you actually get some of the books on these issues. But so far, we've been talking about stuff that's implicit within Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus. So I hope this book will help you, or the official DVD series that goes with it. Thanks for watching this unofficial video series. Thanks.